Hello, everyone. Today's episode is on one of my favorite mystics, one of my favorite saints and doctors of the church, Saint John of the Cross. So today we will open up with an episode from his imprisonment, and then we will casually discuss overviews from his life and his teachings, and then next week jump into the dark night of the soul. So, of course, John is a very intricate and deep saint. So here I am only scratching the surface. For more bonus content, including audio episodes, written episodes, as well as content from previous works, prayer books, a Discord, you name it, we have it. Please consider joining the Patreon or simply sharing this podcast or episode with a friend. I hope you enjoy this intro to St. John of the Cross, and I really hope you tune in next week as we really unpack this great saint and mystic. Enjoy. The iron bars on the window were hot to the touch, and yet John had to touch them. Wrapping his fingers around the scorching iron, searing his skin, though he still gripped the bars tighter. While his flesh burned, his head rested upon the cool stone wall as he silently prayed. Out of the depths I cry to thee, O Lord. Hear my voice. Let my words be thy supplication. After repeating the psalm, he let go, his skin still sticking to the metal, and he slumped down in his cell, weak, trembling. His cell was so narrow that he could not even lie down, so he had to sleep standing up. He prayed crouching. His entire body ached, and his soul was so dark. John was forced into the cell by his own brothers, orders from their superiors. John was wanting too many reforms, the monks said, so they revolted. And now he was a prisoner in the only thing he truly loved, the church. He stayed there all day, cramped, standing. He was only fed stale bread and water, if he was even fed at all. So there he stands, his hands still stinging, but this pain seemed to take away the focus from the pain he felt in his legs and his knees and his neck. He then hears keys jingling, and he swiftly feels hands on his arms and back, and he's slowly escorted to the courtyard. The sun so bright it blinds him, but for a moment he's happy that he can stretch his legs. That is, until he's forced down on his knees, whipped and lashed, as his own brothers repeat the Miserere. Have mercy on me, God, in your kindness. In your compassion, blot out my offense. Oh, wash me more and more from my guilt and cleanse me from my sin. The prayer goes on, being lashed at every pause. And that night, crouched in his cell, with only the moonlight on his face and the cold stone on his back, John opened his mouth, and much like the psalms he had been praying, outpoured this poetry from the depths of his soul, from the pits of despair, in the middle of his own personal hell. He cried, "Where have you hidden, O Lord? You wounded me and left me moaning." Weeks went by until one night he heard a creaking. Who could it be? And what was going to happen to him at this hour? But to his surprise, the door opened and no one was there. Was it an angel, like the one who freed St. Peter from his prison? Too weak to walk because his muscles were atrophied, John collapsed onto his knees. He peeked out the door and he saw no one. But across the hall, he noticed the fluttering shutters of a window. So he crawled, unsure if it was a trap, but he was willing to risk anything now, so he drug himself to the window, propping himself up on the ledge, and he faced it. The cool wind on his face, no idea how hard or long the fall was going to be, but knowing he did not want to die a prisoner, he jumped, he dove right out, and miraculously he landed in a pile of brush. Whether it was God or adrenaline or God-given adrenaline, John was then able to stand and run painfully off the grounds. He ran through the night until he reached a local convent run by his spiritual mother, Teresa. The last thing he remembered was seeing the double doors before collapsing and blacking out. And then he awoke to 4 nuns tending to his wounds, ensuring that he was safe. And while they treated his physical wounds, John would go on to teach us all about a more profound wound. A wound that runs so deep that it touches our soul, a wound that goes beyond words, a wound that comes from the depth, a wound that is filled with love, a wound that is filled with yearning, the wound of God, the wound of love. This is another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue, and this is St. John of the Cross. Peace be with you and with your spirit. Welcome to another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue. I am your host, W. So today we will be talking about one of my favorite mystics and saints and doctors of the church, St. John of the Cross. And there's so many wonderful things about this great mystic and saint, which is why he is the mystical doctor of the church. And one thing I really appreciate about him being a doctor of the church is that his writings are so elevated, yet his writings do not come necessarily purely from intellect. Rather, his writings and his teachings are poetry. He is known for writing mystical poetry, art, a rhythm of God that pours forth from him, something he has experienced. So this episode, we are going to get to know him, and in the next episode, we will discuss some of his teachings, particularly on the dark night of the soul. And also, as with every saint I talk about in this season and in previous seasons, I could spend an entire podcast in of itself, thousands of episodes just on St. John of the Cross. There is no way I can realistically explain all of the nuances, explain all of the historical criteria that goes into understanding him. So this will be base level, but I hope it is enough to make you want to dive in further to the thought, but also the heart of this great saint and mystic. So John was born in Avila, Spain. If that name sounds familiar to you, it is because later he will team up with the great Teresa of Avila. He was born in 1542. He always wanted to be a priest, and he was ordained in the Carmelite order, but soon he felt a call to be a Carthusian. So Carthusian order are hermits. They have a strict means of religious contemplation. They live cloistered, they live in silence. So you may wonder, why not stay a Carmelite? Well, we don't really know for sure, but we do know during this time that Teresa of Avila was reforming the order, so we can make the assumption that the order may have been a little too rowdy and he wanted something more contemplative. So Teresa hears about this young, impressive priest who is very focused on contemplation. And if you haven't heard my earlier episodes on mystical prayer, check it out. A lot of times we hear the word contemplation and we think we are literally contemplating something, but contemplation is actually a gift from God. It is more of a unitive experience, so to speak. So she heard about John, and she recruited John to assist her in reforming the men's Carmelite order. So, about the reform, really quickly, we covered this in the St. Teresa of Avila episodes, but it's easy to summarize. Basically, there was a lack of structure, there was a lack of routine in these Carmelite monasteries. Teresa wanted a return to a life of simple, quiet mental prayer. And this work had papal approval. Not only approval, but the Pope was actually invested and working alongside Teresa in these reforms. So eventually, these reforms created massive conflict within the Carmelite communities, all the way up to the superiors. And John was at a monastery trying to work on reform, and he was asked to leave and return to his home monastery, but he refused because he was there on orders from the Pope. Therefore, John was imprisoned by his own brothers. He was forced in a 10 by 6 foot cell, which is more like a closet. It was so narrow he could not even lie down. He had to stand the whole time. And also every afternoon he was publicly lashed while the brothers ate lunch as they repeated the Miserere psalm. And he was only given 1 meal a day of stale bread and water. So let's think about this. Let's put ourselves in that scenario. We are so on fire with the love of God. We are so fueled by this contemplative experience we have had with God. St. John of the Cross had beautiful experiences in prayer. One of the most famous was he had a vision, and the vision had him looking at Christ crucified from above, as if the Father in heaven was looking down at the cross. And he drew out this vision into a sketch, and that sketch was actually later used by Salvador Dali in one of his works. So he had many more intense experiences with God. So his heart was on fire with God. He was very into prayer, mystical union. And he simply wants to promote that in his monasteries. And what do? They imprison him, and they lash him, and they beat him. His own brothers, his own order, which he joined at a very young age. So of course his heart was broken. And this suffering, though, when he was imprisoned, something bubbled up, something came forth. Words flowed out from his soul. So one night in particular, he was standing in his cell, and words just flowed forth from his mouth in the form of lyrical poetry. And a guard was even impressed by this, so he even gave John eventually pen and paper to write it down. And this became his most famous poem, or his first famous poem, the Spiritual Canticle, and we will cover that soon. But I find that the Spiritual Canticle, while it's a short work, it's really a microcosm of John's complete theology. So depending on the story, though, going back to the imprisonment, either an angel or the aforementioned sympathetic guard loosened the bars or the door so John could escape, and he escaped through a window, propelling himself down or just jumping down. He crawled and limped to a nearby convent in Toledo, one of Teresa of Avila's convents, and the nuns there nursed him back to health and hid him from the superiors who were looking for him. They were going around looking for him, but they kept him hidden. So this would eventually result in the Pope approving a new sect entirely for the Carmelites. So rather than trying to reform the existing ones, they formed a new order called the Discalced or Shoeless Carmelites, because they wore sandals, not shoes. So this would end most of the tension, as they could now exist in a separate order. But John was now living with these nuns, and Teresa made him their spiritual director, their confessor, and eventually they found this writing and they asked him to explain it, this spiritual canticle poem. So then he wrote commentary on each stanza explaining what he meant, and this would then lead to him becoming the vicar general, which is essentially the head priest of various Carmelite monasteries and convents. And here, even from Teresa, he would be asked to write more on prayer and more on the spiritual life. He was known as a great spiritual advisor, a great confessor. During confessions, he would give people small pieces of paper with quotes on them and ask them to meditate on it. And these were later compiled into a book called Sayings of Love and Light. He was also a noted exorcist, preacher. And even though he was a vicar general, he was still very humble, and he still was very hands-on with his communities. John was eventually called into a new post in Castile, but when he arrived, he fell ill with an infection, and he sadly died just at the age of 49. And it's widely believed that his imprisonment weakened his health, as well as his ascetic way of living also contributed to his short life. And quickly after his death, thousands of people rushed to him, trying to get pieces of his habit as a relic. And then, which was very common in this brutish era of Catholicism, various churches around Spain also argued over his body parts, one taking a hand, another a foot, and so on, so they could have relics of this great saint. He was beatified in 1675, canonized in 1726. Then 1926, he was named the mystical doctor of the church. And being a doctor of a church means that their writings are an, if not the, authority on a particular subject. So his writings are considered the authority on Catholic mysticism. All right, so that was a quick overview of his bio, but let's talk about his writings and his work. So first, I think it's really important to understand John's upbringing, John's spiritual direction. Remember, he was under the direction of Teresa of Avila. And I feel as if many people jump into reading and exploring John of the Cross without really understanding or getting to know Teresa of Avila. And I recommend start with Teresa of Avila. Teresa, to me, gives much more of a down-to-earth and simple way of explaining the mystical life and the spiritual life. And it's not because John is overly complex. He can be, but more so that John is speaking from a place of understanding Teresa. He's almost building upon the interior castle to an extent, so it helps, which is why Teresa is also a doctor of the church. And as I said before, what I love the most about John of the Cross is that he's a doctor of the church, and his writings are not overtly theological or philosophical. Now, yes, John of the Cross was a well-educated priest. He studied in the Thomist tradition. He studied with many great teachers in the lineage, actually, of Thomas Aquinas. He studied under students of Thomas Aquinas, so he was very theologically adept. But at the heart of it, his writings are poetry, and he's considered one of Europe's greatest poets, not religious poets or religious writers, just one of the greatest poets ever, period. And I think this is important because it shows that mysticism can go beyond intellect. It's going beyond, it's transcending, it's art, it's poetry, and that's what makes him the mystical doctor. And his theology is that too. His theology goes beyond, which we will get to. So if you read his work, what you'll notice is he will have one stanza, so 2 sentences, and then 25 pages about what these stanzas mean. And what I really enjoy too is, for instance, his commentary on the spiritual canticle. Remember, he wrote a lot of that down before, weeks, months before ever writing commentary on it, if not years. So when he did write commentary, he essentially said, this was a outflowing of the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to give you commentary now, but I can't promise that this is what I meant when I wrote it. And I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Because sometimes those experiences are so powerful, they're so personal, they're so in the moment, they're an outpouring right there, that trying to now go back and intellectualize it, it simply won't have the same effect. And I think that's so beautiful and transcendent. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about him. So let's talk about some of his most notable works. The first I want to talk about, of course, is the spiritual canticle. And I feel as if this one's often overlooked. And I'm not sure why. I think because people see the dark night of the soul and they jump in on it because it sounds cool. But the spiritual canticle, like I said earlier, it's just a great summary of his entire way of thinking, his entire POV. So this is what was written when he was imprisoned. So really, and I know we haven't talked about the Dark Night yet, but we're seeing those Dark Night of the soul concepts, but also he lays down the general mystical process of seeking a hidden God. It's also abundant in Teresa of Avila's work. So the poem mirrors the Song of Songs. In the Song of Songs, you have a bride who is looking for the bridegroom, searching for the bridegroom. And eventually, the bridegroom is now searching for the bride. And of course, this is a representation of the soul looking for God and God looking for the soul. And you have that in the spiritual canticle as well. You have the lover, which is the soul, looking for the beloved, which is God. Sometimes those phrases are flip-flopped, though. So you have this seeking, the same thing. And you also have these themes of desolation, consolation, seeking, yearning, wondering why God might be turning his face away from us, and then going to search God in new places. And we have a lot of themes of transcendence and how God goes beyond the physical. I'm going to get somewhat deep into the spiritual canticle in the next episode. And I really only have to recite a few stanzas of it, because to me, just those first few stanzas are more than enough to understand this great saint. Then you have the ascent of Mount Carmel, which one could say it's almost John's interior castle. It's this process of growing closer to God. So the ascent, interior castle, they actually work very well together, because you can pinpoint stages in his ascent just as you can in the interior castle. So the most memorable part of the ascent is his concept of the dark night of the senses. This is God weaning us from sense pleasure, and the dark night of the soul. And this is God even forcing us to go beyond our own view of God, because we may even be attached to God. And that might sound wild, but in our human understanding, we can only grasp so much, and we can even become dependent on these graces, these consolations. So the dark night of the soul may be God hiding from us to a certain extent. Now, my next episode will be on the dark night of the senses and soul, so stay tuned. But I will say, these concepts have kind of become synonymous with having a spiritual crisis or having a bad couple of weeks. And that's fine, but the dark night is really part of a larger spiritual process. And tying that back to the interior castle, the dark night happens within the later mansions of the interior castle. So you can see that this is actually an advanced stage of prayerfulness. We'll get into that next week. You also have the living flame of love. This is a very short work, 4 stanzas or so, and it discusses being wounded in love. So it's short, it's succinct, and you often find it in books alongside his other works because it's brief, but it's profound. It's about being wounded in love. It is about opening our hearts. It is about how sometimes suffering, sometimes a dark night, leads us closer to understanding God and opening our hearts to others. John is also known as a negative theologian, and I don't mean that as in he says bad things or he's pessimistic, though I'm talking about negative theology. So negative theology is sometimes also called apophatic theology. So negative theology is an approach to God that focuses on negation. Often we can only say what God is not, is a common phrase you see. And essentially that we can believe that it's more easy to say what God is not rather than what God is. This is a very common aspect of Christian mysticism. It's very akin to a non-duality type thought that you might see in Buddhism or some Advaita in Hinduism, and it goes beyond the material. However, I find John to be a great example of how this apophatic negative theology should be used, because many people only go one way, right? I can never say what God is. But John he doesn't solely focus on what God isn't. It's more about that God is transcendent and how we cannot ever find or unite with God. It's not that. John centers on an increased awareness of God. So there are things we can see. For instance, in the spiritual canticle, John mentions the beauty of God's creation and how we become enamored with it, how we can see God working through creation. But then we think, if God is working through all this creation, if this creation is so beautiful, how much more beautiful is God? So God is not the created, God transcended, but this is pointing to the created. So the beauty in nature points to God, but God is even greater. So it's about transcendence. It's not just about saying no. It's about saying yes, but yes and. Yes, God is in nature, but God is also beyond nature. Yes, but also no. And this is a very, I find, helpful practice sometimes, because it helps you to settle in the mystery at times of life and not being too caught up in the intellect. But the intellect is important, but it allows us to transcend. Another key theme of St. John of the Cross, which I've talked about in the mystical prayer episodes, is the main pathway of mystical contemplation, which is the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. So you see this in so many mystical writings and mystical saints. So the purgative way is getting rid of the things that are holding us back from God, i.e. sin, which I'm using very broadly: selfishness, ego, things like that. So then illuminative is we continue to enlighten ourselves through study, through prayer, but also through living a good, faithful life. And then we unite with God. In a mystical sense, this would be through contemplative prayer and contemplation, but also through garnering graces and even the Mass. And speaking of the Mass, just to show you how universal this concept is, it's right there in the Mass too. In the beginning of Mass, the priest gives us a small absolution, right? We ask God for forgiveness at the start of Mass. And then we hear the gospel, so that's purgative. We hear the gospel, that's illuminative. And then we have the Eucharist, which is unitive. So it's all there. But this negative theology, this apophatic theology from St. John, it plays a crucial role here too, because John teaches that we even have to go beyond our notions of God. We can even become too prideful or overly attached to him if our spirituality is only fueling our ego. And most notably, John mentions that our attachment to graces and consolation also need to go through this process of purgation, illumination, and union. We even need to purge our attachment to God's grace, which leads to illumination and union. And this is key to John's writings around the dark night of the senses and the soul. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, am I too attached to God? Likely not. Likely not. This is a later stage of prayer that happens for people, though I do think that this can be seen in various facets. When we want the coolest rosary, we just want to brag that we've done the rosary. We just want to brag about our spiritual life. Absolutely there. And that does need to be purged. And that can happen no matter where we are in our life. And it happens often because we flock to labels and we flock to wanting to show our status. We're going to get into that next week in depth. All right, so that was a brief overview of John's theology. So, how do you incorporate the great saint into your own spiritual life? Because I do consider John of the Cross a patron of mine. Not necessarily one that I might ask for intercession, but more one that I enjoy his writings and being moved by his writings. Even though he does his own exegesis, his own commentary on his poetry, you can do Lectio Divina with the writings of a great saint, with a Saint Faustina, with a Saint Teresa, with a Saint John of the Cross. So John of the Cross is great for that because he writes symbolically. You can look at his canticles, his writings, and also pull from it. So he is a patron saint of poets, of mystics, of writers. But if we look at his life, what can we call out to him for? Well, if we are persecuted or set aside by our own family, our close friends, just like he was pushed aside due to his own brothers, I think that's a good one as well. How can we honor him? How can we do a ritual alongside him, a novena? I would recommend a very simple novena session where, of course, you find a fitting prayer. Do that for the 9 days. But also during that novena, sit down and read some of his writings. Just read them. You don't even need to read the commentary, though I do recommend it. But maybe if you're just trying to have a meditation session, maybe just read the poetry without the commentary. But that's a simple way, and I recommend that for any saint that's had a lot of writings, to just do that novena and then sit and spend time with their words. You can also invoke some other saints alongside him, some of his spiritual friends. So if you're asking for the intercession of John of the Cross, of course, ask for the intercession of Teresa of Avila. Saint Therese of Lisieux was also a Carmelite, so she would be good as well, even though the timing was different. I think she'd still help you in that scenario. And also Our Lady of Mount Carmel, who was the foundress, who was the patron of the Carmelite order. All right, so I know this was kind of a brief overview, if not a tease, to his more intense teachings next week. But just final thoughts. This man is a treasure when it comes to mystical writing, poetry, mystical theology. And I recommend everyone spend some time with any of his work. I do recommend starting with the spiritual canticle. He also does speak a lot about purgation, and there's a lot of topics that need nuance, which I will be discussing next week. But what I absolutely love the most, and I know I've already mentioned it, is just this concept that our prayer life should always go beyond, should go beyond, beyond, beyond. When we die and we are facing our Creator, our Father, is he going to stand there and say, "Hey, W, did you affirm this correct view of the Trinity? Did you have a Pelagian or a semi-Pelagian view of God?" Or is he going to look at me and ask where I was? Is he going to look at me as if he knows me or not? Is he going to look at me as a friend or a stranger? As someone who tried to draw nearer to him in prayer, or who someone that was trying to figure him out with the mind rather than the heart? Is he going to ask about how many people I assisted within his mystical body? Or is he going to ask me if I aced my theological quizzes? To me, of course, it's going to be, did I know you? Did you love me? Did you seek me as I was seeking you? And St. John of the Cross, while beautifully theological, while beautifully philosophical, he teaches us to go beyond. And that while there is a place for the intellect, there's even more of a place for the heart. St. John of the Cross, patron of mystics, allow us, teach us, and show us how to find the hidden God, how to find the God who has wounded us in love. Be with us, walk with us, and pray for us. Amen. This has been another episode of St. Anthony's Tongue. Thank you for listening, and tune in next week as we discuss the dark night of the soul. God bless you all.